Rest is pretty easy. Just keep your eyes on the monitors.
Hello and welcome to my channel and welcome to my kitchen. This is me, and in case you missed it, my son just turned 15 and I made the mistake of letting him design his own birthday cake. And I've brought you all along for the journey to prove that anyone can make a custom birthday cake. Double back to stages 1 and 2 to see how we baked this cake and how I designed and carved it. We've done the crumb coat and a second layer of buttercream, and the cake has been chilling in the fridge overnight, so it's easier to scrape the edges and make everything nice and smooth. And the smoother your buttercream is, the less likely you are to end up with bubbles or lumps. Once you're satisfied, it's time to make our fondant. You can buy it pre-made, but it's so easy to make. And while I'm here, let me straighten something out. You don't have to use mini marshmallows. You can use any marshmallows, they all work. I have a full list of ingredients and measurements in the description, but it works out about 50-50 ratio with icing sugar and marshmallows. As it starts to cool down, you'll notice that it also starts to get a bit firmer. Dust your work surface with a combination of icing sugar and cornstarch. Scrape out all of your marshmallow mixture and try to work with it while it's still warm. Expect that it's going to be sticky, so you should coat your hands with coconut oil or shortening. Knead everything together until you reach a Play-Doh-like consistency. And a quick bit of info about shortening: it's basically a plant-based fat, but we don't really have that here in Australia, not the way you do in America. We have what's called kofa, which is very similar, and that's what I'm using here instead. It will stop the marshmallow from sticking to your hands, and I usually keep a little bit extra nearby, just in case. Just like buttercream, fondant is something that you can make in advance, and you can even freeze it. All you need to do to get it ready to use again is to warm it up by leaving it out overnight or popping it in the microwave. And since Springtrap is a yellow rabbit, I've also added some yellow gel colouring. Add some coconut oil or shortening to your work surface to prevent sticking. Working with fondant is a lot like playing with Play-Doh, especially when you're shaping. The main thing you'll notice is that fondant stiffens up as it cools down, so sometimes you need to warm it up. Working with fondant is actually a lot easier than it seems, and you can reach a higher decorating potential. As you're rolling it out, use a little bit of corn flour now and again to prevent it from sticking and to maintain stability. Because of the size and shape of this cake, I'm going to cover the whole thing in one single sheet, which means I need to roll it out to the height plus the width plus a little bit extra and make it about ½ centimetre thick. Once it's large enough, carefully peel it back from all the edges to make it easier to move. Add a layer of baking paper and then slowly roll it backwards over the rolling pin so that it's easier to pick up. The baking paper will stop it from sticking to itself. If you make a mistake, simply knead it back together and roll it out again. Take a breath and line it up, then try to do this all in one move. For the best results, make sure your cake is super cold. Try to let gravity be your friend. Lift and fold where you need to, smoothing it down from the top to remove any air bubbles. Because of the split level layer on the front of this cake, I'm going to have extra fondant on the sides. And there are 2 different methods of handling that. I can either cut it off along with the excess around the base, or I can slowly smooth it out until there's no excess at all. Don't worry if the bottom edge doesn't look very neat just yet, it will once we finish smoothing everything down. In this case, I made the decision that it's easy enough to simply cut it off. Smooth it out so it's nice and tight, and try to cut slightly less than you think you need to. The 2 cut edges will actually stick to each other quite easily. And with some careful blending, it won't even look like it's been cut. I'd like you to think of this as a test of your perspective. Is it a flaw or is it a feature? Especially when you're learning, remember to give yourself an inch and to use the difficulty. Springtrap is covered in scars. So in my case, there's no reason I can't leave these gaps and turn it into a feature. And there's no reason I couldn't have done the cut at the back of the head. If this happens to you and you can't fix or hide the fault line, you can always cover it. Knead all of your offcuts together and cover them in cling wrap so they don't dry out. I want to be able to use this line later on, so so I'm not going to try too hard to cover it up. With unwanted cracks, use a blade to cross-hatch the edges to make it easy to blend. Then use a smoothing tool or a spatula to gently buff it out. The friction will help the fondant warm up just enough to bind back together. By using a combination of cross-hatching and buffing, you can make a scar like this one go away completely. Continue smoothing and manipulating your fondant from the top down for an even coverage. And be careful not to rub so hard that you warm up the buttercream underneath. This will also help you find and remove any extra air trapped underneath your fondant. If you don't have a smoothing tool, that's fine, you can do this by hand, and I actually did for many years before finally getting one. One thing I especially love about fondant is that it's so forgiving. Where I'm living at the moment, the weather has more mood swings than a teenager. And while that makes buttercream hard to work with, it doesn't really affect fondant. But it can seem a little bit intimidating, especially if you've never done it before. But remember, as I said, it's a lot like playing with Play-Doh, and the worst case scenario, you make a mistake and you have to stop. Simply pop it in the freezer, and once it's really cold, peel the fondant off and start again. As you can see, I found a nice big air bubble. But they're pretty easy to fix. Move all the air into one spot, pop it with your knife, and then simply push the air out. Using your fingertips or your smoothing tool, press the fondant back down to the buttercream. To patch up the hole we just made, cross-hatch the edges and use a small amount of extra fondant, kind of like a glue, to hold the edges together. Use your smoothing tool or a knife to blend it in so it looks like nothing ever happened. If you have a large amount of cracks all over, it might mean that your fondant is too thick. When it came to planning the design for this cake, I actually had an awful lot of options. There have been so many different images and styles over the years, from fan art to the official games, that I was able to play around, and this is my interpretation of the Springtrap from the movies. Before adding extra features to the face, it helps to map them out, measuring so you know where things should go and how big they should be. For the nose, we need black fondant, and the trick to that is cocoa. This will give you a darker base colour to work with before adding your food colouring, meaning that you won't need as much, and it helps to balance the texture so your fondant doesn't end up too soft or sticky. A nose is pretty easy to make. Start with a ball, pinch around the edges until it becomes a bit of a love heart shape, and I took the back off just to make it easier to stick. Now, originally when I planned this out, I drew eyebrows, but going over it again, Springtrap doesn't have eyebrows, none of the bunnies have eyebrows, so I don't know where that came from, but instead I'm making these into eyelids. And since this is my own original interpretation, it probably wouldn't have mattered if you did have eyebrows. But having to pivot sometimes for the sake of reality isn't a bad thing. Don't pet the sweaty things, as I like to say, and if your fondant starts to sweat, pat it down lightly with some corn flour. To create extra definition around the teeth, I'm adding an upper lip. On the one hand, you can see why it costs so much to order a custom cake. But on the other hand, I hope you can see just how easy it is to do it on your own for a fraction of the cost. Take your time and get creative. Let yourself have fun with it. That being said, I did get a little bit carried away with this upper lip, and I didn't notice my buttercream was starting to melt. And while this is something to watch out for, it's not very common, and in my case it just happened to be a really hot day. After attaching and blending this part of the lip, I pretty much decided it was a little bit too low, so all I've done is I've flipped it up to make it a bit higher. And I kind of like this better. It allows for more space for the teeth, it looks kind of like it's snarling, and I've just gone around to reblend the top. Many years ago I would have had a panic attack about it not quite working out the way I had it in my head, but it's part of the process. I'm going to make the eyes and the teeth out of a little bit of extra white fondant. Give it a quick knead to warm it up, and then add some corn flour and a little bit of cream of tartar, and this will help it firm up. Knead it all together, and if it's still a little bit sticky, add a small amount of extra corn flour. Cream of tartar is also how you would stabilize the fondant if you're making a cake topper or an accessory. We need 2 rows of teeth, top and bottom. and I'm using my ruler to make sure they're all straight and all cut about the same size. After they're all cut, set them aside so they have a chance to firm up. For the eyes, knead your offcuts back together and roll it out again. I'm using a piping tip as a makeshift cookie cutter so they're all the same size, and I'm cutting out extra just in case I need them. Because of the eyelids, I need to custom fit each of the eyes, but it's important that they still match. If there's something wrong with the eyes, the whole face can look off. A drop of water on the back of each eye will help them stick, and a small paintbrush will help to make sure you don't add too much. And now for the teeth. Before you glue them down, line them up and get your spacing right to make sure that they're symmetrical. And once you're happy with how they look, glue them down starting from the center so that you've got an even amount on each side. On the home stretch now, and for me, this is one of the most exciting parts. The eyes are the window to the soul, and I wanted to try to capture that same atmosphere and feeling you get when he first stares at you through the screen. The feeling that he's almost watching you. So I'm using silver cake decorating beads to try to capture that same animatronic, hollow vibe. For the shading, all I'm using is a little bit of extra cocoa powder. This will give me the right kind of shadow effect in a kind of rusty, withered kind of way. Everything past this point is all about the detail and attention to detail. And that's actually part of why I prefer working with fondant, because you can get a much higher level of detail with fondant compared to buttercream. But don't get carried away. Here you can see why I went with red for the buttercream. Springtrap is covered in damage, and I wanted to add that extra layer of detail. And with this fault line, you can see why I didn't try too hard to cover it up, because I knew I wanted to incorporate it. Move your light source to provide a natural guideline which shows you where you should add your shading. And I'm using a paintbrush and a makeup brush to gradually build up the layers of colour for my shading. While cocoa powder is perfect for colouring this cake, it doesn't work for everything, and you can make your own colour by mixing cornstarch with a few drops of food colouring. Bake off the extra moisture and use it as a powder. For even more detail, I've made an edible paint from icing sugar, cocoa powder, and a few drops of red food colouring. And you can make that as thick or as thin as you like by either adding a bit of water or a bit of cornstarch. Fill any of the wounds with extra buttercream, and it's okay if it's a little bit messy, that just kind of goes with it. The ears are made from Rice Krispie and covered and decorated in the same way as the face. But that's another story.
Piece of cake.
Thanks for joining me. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I look forward to seeing you next week.